Welcome to the Night Tube. I'm Stephen Knight, and I'm very pleased to be joined by Alexander Meleagrou-Hitchens. Alexander, how's it going, sir?
Very well, thanks.
Excellent. The reason I asked you on is to speak about your excellent book, Incitement, Anwar Al-Awlaki's Western Jihad. I think it's a stellar piece of journalism. I'm pretty sure that name's going to trip me up a few times as we're talking. Anwar Al-Awlaki. Before we jump into that, maybe you can tell us a little bit about yourself. How would you describe what you do to people who are not aware?
Yeah, so my day job is I'm a lecturer at King's College London. Official title is Lecturer in Terrorism and Radicalisation. I also do work for think tanks that study this. Essentially, kind of just interested in how extremists and particularly terrorist groups recruit, how they present their ideas and make them attractive to people, and how they get people to act on those ideas, which is kind of a pretty difficult thing to fully understand, that link between ideas and action. And, how does someone go from believing all this stuff to actually risking their lives for it? And I don't think there's a clear answer to that, but I spent a lot of my time trying to better understand and explain that, essentially. And I think I kind of started really with mostly interested in jihadism and Al-Qaeda after 9/11, but it kind of evolved into a wider interest in kind of violent extremist groups in the West.
Excellent. All the fun stuff then, basically.
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
So, moving back to the book, Incitement, what I noticed about it is it's very clinical in a good way. It's very facts-driven. It's all about the chronology. It's all about how we know what we know about the situation. And it strikes me that when taking a project on board such as this, there's a few options in the way you can approach it. You can approach it in the way you have, which personally I found more attractive, or you can sort of approach it as a polemic, because no doubt, having been so invested in this topic for so long, you have some very strong personal opinions. However, in the book, they don't come through. It's a very clinical, very facts-driven approach. Now, is that a conscious effort? Do you find yourself having to check your biases? How did you decide which way you was going to approach this?
If I wrote this 10 years ago in my early 20s, I think I would have been a little bit more forward, I think, and more biased, frankly, and more openly, and less aware of my own biases. And I think, for better or worse, working in academia definitely made me kind of be a bit more careful about that kind of thing, being as much as possible, because people say that, you recognize your bias and therefore you protect yourself. In the end, you're still going to have it, right? You're still going to be biased in one way or the other. You're going to have inherent biases that, the reason you do certain work is because of underlying biases that you have. That's what drives you towards certain things. But as I worked in academia and saw how important it was to try to compartmentalize that stuff, I did my best to try to put that to the side, or at least openly weigh all the arguments, and allow the reader to kind of make their own decisions. And I think that was kind of the final thing for me, was to not push the reader in one direction or another. And so the book is kind of it tries to tread that line between academic, but also trade, also sort of, for example, for an audience such as yourself, people who are not, digging into the kind of boring academic journals and all, but who are interested in the topic and want access to it, but at the same time satisfying the needs of, academic reviewers who have to, let the book actually be published. So I tried to tread that line. I suppose I'm glad to hear that, you couldn't, it wasn't that easy to pin down my personal views. I think that's probably something I did consciously try to do. And, I teach on this topic, terrorism and radicalization, and it's very, controversial. It's very, everyone has their views on it. And, I think having taught that for many years, I think I also honed that ability to try not to tell my students, what to think about it, but rather kind of how to think about it. And, it's probably a result of just being in academia for a long time. And though there's a line there, because I think something that frustrates people, academics, is they never bloody tell you what they actually think. And it can be a bit frustrating, especially for non-academics. So I hope I got the balance right, but I think some people may have wanted one of more of the other, but I think I did my best on that front.
It certainly comes through, and like you say, I mean, the writing style is very accessible as well and enjoyable. It's not sort of like an academic paper that's bogged down in all the minutiae. So tell me a bit about Anwar Al-Awlaki, because he's this huge, prominent figure. He's massively influential and remains to this day to a large extent. So who is he? How best to describe him?
Well, he's a very unique figure, because most people who follow the topic of jihad in the West will know Al-Awlaki as this recruiter of Western Muslims to jihadism and to Al-Qaeda, and certainly at that latter part of his career, that's what he was, and he was for sure the most effective English language propagandist and ideologue and recruiter for Al-Qaeda, and in fact, he was also ended up becoming a strategist for Al-Qaeda. He's pretty much the guy who came up with some help, but with the idea of the jihad movement in the West pursuing a kind of lone actor or lone wolf terrorism strategy, to say, what I want to do is to essentially communicate these ideas and translate them and make them accessible to a Western audience in order to encourage Westerners to take up arms on their own accord and conduct, attacks, within their capabilities. But the unique thing about him, because he's not the only English-speaking jihadist preacher, there are others out there. Anjem Chowdhury, for those who who follow this closely in the UK, is one of the well-known. But he's actually kind of known in the US now. But the thing with Al-Awlaki is that he started his career as this mainstream preacher, Islamic preacher in the United States. If you were, my generation, English-speaking Muslim, in the 1990s, maybe in your teens, coming to your early 20s, and you were trying to reconnect with Islam or trying to, understand your religion, it's very likely that Al-Awlaki would have been the person whose work you would have at some point come across. He was a very, very popular English language Islamic, very conservative Islamic preacher, but by no means a jihadist or open extremist or recruiter for terrorism. He had positions at a number of mainstream mosques and institutions in the United States. He had, by the end of the 1990s, had a massive reputation among English speaking, so that's also British as well as American young Muslims, who was kind of able to bring Islam to life for a generation of people who may be born Muslim, but who were maybe alienated from the Islam of their parents. Their parents often maybe first, maybe second generation, whose Islam was very culturally infused, was very connected with the home country they came from, and didn't really have much relevance or use to a young Western Muslim. So Al-Awlaki was very, very effective at bringing the stories of Islam and the primary texts of Islam to life for Westerners and making them relevant to their lives. And so, by the time 9/11 happened, he was pretty much the most popular English-speaking conservative imam there or preacher in the English-speaking world. And he essentially, and the book, one of the things that the book does, it kind of tries to do two things. One is track his own evolution from being this apparently mainstream preacher and very, very popular English-speaking Islamic preacher, and evolving into this open jihadist recruiter strategist. So it does that. It also, at the same time, tries to explain, once we get to that jihad phase, how he makes jihadism Western, how he westernizes jihadism, an idea that really was developed for kind of post-colonial or South Asian or Middle Eastern audiences. How do you make those ideas relevant to Westerners? And he did that way more effectively than anyone else. So those are two things the book does, and that's kind of what makes him this unique figure. All the other jihadist preachers we know about in English, Anjem Chowdhury, Abu Hamza al-Masri, the hook-handed sheikh, if you remember him, Abdullah al-Faisal, and there's a few others. these guys were, they emerged as jihadists. They were always, that's the jihad preacher. And so they always had a very narrow set of followers and adherents. He's the first one who went from, head of one of the most important mainstream mosques in the United States, the Darul Hijra Mosque in Virginia, to actual member of Al-Qaeda, and publicly does that. And that's a story that may never be replicated again. That's what made him very effective and unique, because, he wasn't just the guy talking about jihad. He was the guy who was talking about all of Islam in the round, and then making jihad seem really this legitimate, important part of Islam in a way that the other guys you could have just dismissed and say, okay, all they're interested in is jihadism. But this guy was talking about everything else, but also said, as he evolved, was also saying, actually, jihad is this crucial part. So, he had a much, much bigger following, than any of these other guys. And he took a lot of people on that journey with him.
Yeah, so he sort of instilled a feeling of grievance amongst Western Muslims to the West, I suppose, and that always throws up this age-old debate of foreign policy versus religious ideology. And obviously, I doubt. I mean, they're not mutually exclusive, but where do you best, thread them to concepts?
Yeah, there would always be a jihad movement, and there would always be Islamism, whatever Western powers did in their foreign policies. But in terms of events that propagandists from that movement can exploit, of course, Afghanistan and particularly Iraq were very exploitable moments for people whose job it was to sell you an idea that there's a war on Islam taking place, right? And so the kind of centrifugal force of the ideology of jihadism is that there's this conspiracy theory, essentially, that there's a war on Islam taking place. And for many, the war on Islam means American bombs and tanks in Muslim majority countries occupying Iraq, Israel, Palestine, these kind of things. But Al-Awlaki needed to essentially find a way to make that war on Islam idea relevant to Western audiences, people who were living in peaceful countries, whose experiences as Muslims living in the West were largely positive, who were not experiencing, particularly before 9/11, and even in many of the years after 9/11, that really hard anti-Islam right-wing politics that we kind of know about today, surprisingly, took a while to mature. And after 9/11, that wasn't really what was going on. And we had George Bush telling us that Islam was a religion of peace pretty much immediately after 9/11. And that line, Islam is a religion of peace, came from President George W. Bush, of all people. And many people are surprised at that. So, in a time when, Muslims were not under the spotlight, and perhaps the way they are a little bit more today, he had to find a way to make that idea that they're under threat, realistic to them. He had to find ways to put that on their front doorstep, right? To bring that war on Islam home and say, it's not just the bombs falling in Iraq and Afghanistan. It's not just Israel, Palestine. It's stuff happening in the West. And his job was to identify that stuff and to highlight it. And so your question essentially comes down to the role of grievances versus ideas, right? How much does a grievance like foreign policy or something, how much does that influence the radicalization of say, a Western Muslim? But the thing people often don't think about is how sometimes someone like Al-Awlaki and effective recruiters and ideologues, their job is to actually identify and highlight the grievances for an audience that wasn't aware of them before, right? So he's not often talking to an audience full of grievances that they themselves have. His job is to identify grievances for them and to say, oh, by the way, this situation that you thought was okay or you didn't think about is actually an example of why Islam is under attack. And these would be examples from their lives, their context. So he would say things like, after 9/11 and as he was becoming more radical, there was a lot of talk about what is moderate Islam. What is we need to empower moderate Muslims. And how do we do that? And this was a big discourse, and I think to some extent still is, but was very much so at that time. And Al-Awlaki said, actually, you know what? This whole talk of a moderate Muslim itself is part of the war on Islam. you have to understand these conversations about defining what a moderate Muslim is basically the West, the secular West, trying to reshape Islam, trying to alter the precepts of Islam so that they can match with secular Western ideologies. And that itself is a much more insidious part of this war in Islam. It's not just the bombs and the fighting and the killing. It's this ideological campaign in the West being waged to undermine your religion, to change the very core of your religion. And so all of a sudden, Americans are like, oh yeah, all these discussions that I see on CNN or wherever else about moderate Islam, this is just an attempt to defang and weaken our religion. So it's about taking things that these people would have been aware of in the West and reframing them so they viewed it through this idea that Islam was under attack. And he did it as well with the Muhammad cartoons, which we can talk about as well. But he was really effective at that. So going back to your original question, foreign policy versus everything else, foreign policy certainly provides opportunities for people who are looking to radicalize and recruit. But at the same time, what foreign policy led to the killing of 12 cartoonists in Paris? You know what I mean? So the killing of 12 cartoonists in Paris, by the way, Al-Awlaki was a big inspiration for it. So let's not get too wrapped up with what we're doing to bring this on ourselves. We are dealing with, forces of reactionary religion that is very determined to kind of undo a lot of the progress of the kind of the liberal democratic world. And yes, sometimes we make steps that help them in their propaganda, but these guys will still be around. They're still there. They may not be able to recruit as much, but we can't really take that into account for every policy we whenever we develop or formulate a policy, foreign or domestic, we cannot think, okay, well, how might this be exploited by ABC adversary, whoever it is. So in that sense, while we have to acknowledge the role foreign policy plays in being exploited by extremists, we have to also really be aware that there's more at play here. These guys don't just want America out of the Middle East. They don't just want, Israel to go away. They want to completely reshape the way that, human affairs are governed in the most kind of reactionary and extreme illiberal way you can pretty much imagine.
Yeah, it was very helpful of ISIS to make this abundantly clear in their propaganda magazine Debate, wasn't it? The Reasons Why We Hate You, I think it was titled. Yeah. And they were fairly dismissive of foreign policy as the only reason. Yes,
so, and that actually, and sorry to interrupt you, but that actually has, often, and Al-Awlaki himself brings this up. He says, don't narrow this down to foreign policy. We've got a much bigger program here than just, dealing with American foreign policy. We have big ideas about how we want our societies to be run, Muslim majority societies. Then after that, ideas about how your society needs to be run. Now, of course, the chances of them having any influence in how our societies are governed is basically, not non-existent or very, very small. But as we've seen, not so small in other parts of the world, Islamic State and its relative success, and groups like Al-Shabaab in East Africa and Boko Haram in Nigeria, whenever they're given the opportunity, they show us exactly what they want. And it isn't a matter of just, freeing people from the, occupation of Western powers. It's, putting them under another very, very different form of governance.
Yeah. Well, I think the most sensible voices that talk about Islamic extremism are very clear in separating out your sort of Islamists from your moderate Muslims and your secular liberal Muslims and your Salafis, etc. And I think we understand, of course, that the majority of Muslims are not about to, commit acts of jihad, for instance. But is it not an uncomfortable problem that the doctrines of Islam, when taken at face value, when taken literally, they are fairly conducive to an extremist viewpoint? Is that not a huge issue for one of the largest monotheisms?
Look, there's a couple of things that Islam has that it makes it unique from the other monotheisms and claims that it makes, right? So the major claim that it makes, of course, is that Jesus was a prophet, and there were prophets, but Muhammad is the final prophet, and therefore, supersedes the claims of all the previous prophets. It also, unlike the Bible, the Quran is the actual word of God, which again makes it more difficult in theory, more difficult to critique. And then also you've got the foundational history of Islam, which, by the way, people like Al-Awlaki and jihadists in general take huge advantage of, which is, Islam was born through, struggle and in fighting. Muhammad, as the foundational story goes, has Islam revealed, has the Quran revealed to him from God, and begins to, try to proselytize and spread the faith in pre-Islamic Mecca, and is not welcomed with open arms by any means. It is rejected and fought and tried, and many attempts to assassinate him. And Islam, in order to survive, Islam had to, and Muhammad had to fight and fight quite a lot. And there was, those foundational years of Islam were very, very violent, and that's a fact. It's neither here nor there in the end. But what jihadists do is they take that early period. Al-Awlaki does this very, very well. He takes those stories, those early stories of Muhammad, and then basically the first three generations of Muslims, and that is the what is often referred to as Salaf al-Salih, which is basically where the word Salafi comes from. And he says, look, Muslims today are in the same situation as Muhammad was in those early years. They are assailed from all sides, and Muslims have to respond and react in the same way that Muhammad did, and they have to fight back. This is the only legitimate response to the situation. That juxtaposition of those early violent years of Islam onto modern day is a very, very dangerous thing to do without context, without anything else. Now, there's plenty of scholarship in the meantime, in the thousands of years between these two, that puts more context and tells you cannot just juxtapose these moments onto each other. Jihadists are taking an incredibly simplistic approach here, but for those who are not, scholars, Islamic scholars or theologians, for your average kid who's just learning this stuff from Al-Awlaki, but it's quite convincing. It's like, well, yes, we're supposed to, Muhammad is the greatest Muslim. We're supposed to emulate his example. It appears we're in the same situation today. If Al-Awlaki says so, I'll believe it. So that juxtaposition of that early period onto today is very dangerous. And he also makes a lot of use of basically these kind of these stories about Islam, about those early years. And actually, this is called Sirah, and this is in the early parts of the book. And he takes those stories, and again, he uses them to explain situations today. And actually, the Sirah is not considered to be a very reliable source of information in Islamic scholarship, not without a lot of other aspects. So Hadith scholarship, Quran scholarship. If you just use Sirah in the way that Al-Awlaki does, you're actually using a very flimsy source. So yes, Islam has this issue, but actually, until Islamists emerged in the kind of 50s, right, in Egypt and South Asia with Hassan al-Banna and Abu Allah Maududi in Pakistan, Hassan al-Banna in India, and Hassan al-Banna in Egypt. Jihadism is actually quite a new thing. So Islam went long enough without that. Something else was needed, and what Islamists did was essentially fuse together kind of modern revolutionary politics with Islam. In a way that made it a much more combustible set of ideas. So I think Islam went long enough without encouraging, any more so than any monotheism or monotheistic religion, without encouraging kind of terrorism or that kind of violence. It needed actually quite a modern development, which was Islamism, which essentially emerges in kind of post-colonial and colonial Egypt and colonial and post-colonial India. as this kind of, and that the problem there is they emerged with the West as enemy number one, because you've got, these colonial powers in these countries, and you've got these individuals who are trying to figure out what's the problem with our society. Why is, our religion in the state that it's in? Why are Muslims in the state that it's in? And they were able to identify the West very specifically, and Western liberal democracy, liberal secularism, as the big threat. And once that happened, that's when it started becoming a much, much bigger and organized problem. But up until then, there was plenty of scholarship and work that was able to deal with that violent early history of Islam and contextualize it and keep it there, rather than keep bringing it into the present. So I think as I said, there are things that Islam has to deal with, but at the same time, there's a lot of context there that means that I don't think it's as simple to say that we can say that Islam kind of was always headed in that direction. It could have gone other ways. There were plenty of movements within Islam over the centuries that certainly tried that, and the fact they didn't succeed perhaps tells us something. But it's, without being an Islamic scholar myself, that's basically the kind of the limit of where I can go on that.
Yeah, it's a very detailed answer. So Al-Awlaki, should I say? I knew it'd get me eventually. Well, he was prolific in his writing. That became very popular amongst jihadists and Islamists. So did a lot of his audio sermons, sort of passed around in the jihadi underworld. And you mentioned in your book that a lot of his sermons remained online on YouTube, for instance, for the longest time before being pulled by the digital overlords. Now, where is your line on the battle between projecting your Islamist views and censorship or freedom of expression and Islamism? Do you think his sermons should be removed from the internet, or do you think they should be allowed to be heard?
Look, I mean, if overall, I would say that work that directly incites murder shouldn't be accessible on public platforms. I wouldn't sit here and kind of defend the right of Al-Awlaki's work to be kind of on every platform online. I wouldn't go that far. But just to give you a specific example of the problem of kind of online material or extremist material online, is the story of a woman called a British Bangladeshi called Roshanar Chowdhury, who I think was around 2008. Was one of the people who kind of started this this pattern or this tactic of attacking MPs in their surgeries. This is something that's become a kind of pressingly common or relatively common. It's quite strange actually. In the UK, we've had 2 MPs murdered, and one, and this in the case I'm talking about, attempted murder. Just imagine if elected officials in the United States were being killed like that. What a story that would be. I mean, that's the situation we're in here. But in 2008, Roshanar Chowdhury tries to kill her local MP, Stephen Timms, Labour MP. She tried to kill. She goes to his surgery, waits patiently to meet him, goes into his office and stabs him, I don't know, 8 times. Thankfully, he's not killed. And it turns out she does it because he had voted in favor of the Iraq War under Blair years earlier. He was Labour MP. And it turns out that she was very inspired by Al-Awlaki's work. She explains, and very rare actually in the UK to get access to police interviews post-arrest with terrorists. And actually, if you go on the Guardian website, I think they still have a transcript of her interview with the police right after she was arrested for this attempted murder. And she says how Al-Awlaki was the person who explained to her in his work the importance, firstly, that there was this war on Islam taking place, and also the importance of Muslims taking it upon themselves to do something about it and explaining it, and also the religious justification for it. And they said, how did you come across this work? And she said, oh, it was on YouTube. And they said, so how did you find him on YouTube? And he said, well, she said, I was watching, there's a genre of videos, you may have seen a genre of video of people who converting to Islam on video. The conversion to Islam is very, very easy. You basically just say the testament of faith. There was only one God, and Muhammad is his messenger, essentially.
So now you're a Muslim, Alexander. Do you realize what you've just done here?
Yeah. And there's this big genre of videos, sort of people who are celebrating that, and people say, oh, we got this brother, this sister converted, and so this. And she said, I was just watching those videos. I was watching these videos of people converting to Islam, and then one of the recommended videos that comes up was an Al-Awlaki sermon. And there you have this example of how people can actually, on these open mainstream platforms like YouTube at that time, could just kind of stumble upon an extremist sermon. And if you have to think about how a lot of people, for them, if something's on YouTube, it's legitimate. Sadly, we're still kind of in that situation with conspiracy theorists and all the rest of it. If something's on YouTube, for many, the assumption is, well, it's gotten through these sort of stringent, measures that YouTube put in place to be published on this platform. So surely it's legitimate. So she's not only not looked for it, the algorithms that are recommending videos to her recommend Al-Awlaki to her, and that's how she comes across him. So when it comes to his work on YouTube, and in fact, I at some points advised Google on this and said, this is the problem you've got, is you cannot have people just who aren't even looking for this stumble across it. You cannot have this stumble across situation. Okay. At the very least, you have to have this stuff where you got to really want to find it. So that's kind of where we are today. We're in a situation today where if you want to find hardcore jihadist propaganda, you've got to kind of, really start digging around. It's not that hard, sadly, but you're not going to stumble across on YouTube anymore. But there was this time when that was so, in that sense, those mainstream mega platforms like YouTube should have essentially removed all of his work, because otherwise it was presenting him as this mainstream or this legitimate figure. And that was very responsible. Overall, yes, there's no real reason why Al-Awlaki's work should be accessible to people. But it is still very easy to get. And actually, one of the places that don't get enough scrutiny, we talk about these platforms like YouTube, Twitter, Telegram, and all the rest of it. What often doesn't get attention is the Internet Archive. I don't know if you've come across.
Oh yeah, like the Wayback Machine type.
Wayback Machine. You can find, and without kind of helping people access experienced material, it doesn't get any scrutiny. No one talks about this, but you can find anything you want when it comes to extremist propaganda of any type on archive.org. It is all there. Right now, you can go find his whole library of work on there. And for some weird reason, they don't really get the same amount of scrutiny. I don't know why. They don't get that same kind of scrutiny as these major platforms like Google and the rest of it. Actually, a huge amount of that material, from the right-wing extremist stuff to the jihadi stuff, is very easily accessible, still on archive.org. You still got to look for it. At least we don't have this situation where people are stumbling across stuff, and I think that's an improvement. There's other measures that have been put in place, where for the stuff that is still on YouTube, there's how they use the advertising algorithms, right? So when you search something on Google or on YouTube, out of sheer coincidence, the ads you get on the sidebar start to match exactly the kind of, if you're looking for a new car or a new fridge, you'll notice that the ads start tailoring themselves to things you recently searched. So they decided to harness that technology and say, if someone starts searching for keywords that we think are in one way or the other connected to extremism, we can direct them to videos and ads for kind of alternative videos, kind of counter messaging videos. So there are things like that going on. It's hard to gauge how effective they are, but they are doing that kind of stuff. And
yeah, I'm not sure I like the algorithm either way on that one, I'll be honest. But
yeah, well, that's how they make money in the end.
Yeah, for
We're
sure.
the product, right? Not Google. The user is the product.
Well, you mentioned moments ago the issue we've had in the UK of politicians murdered at the hands of extremists. We've had Joe Cox, which was categorised as a far-right case of terrorism. We've recently had the murder of David Amess, who all reports suggest it was an Islamist terror attack. That's obviously still being investigated. And as somebody like yourself who's spent a lot of time studying ideology, studying radicalisation, what thoughts did you have when you turned on our television to watch our MPs debating online anonymity in response to this terror attack?
I mean, it didn't really make a huge amount of sense. Firstly, online anonymity and trying to do something about that is a complete red herring. There's so many things wrong with having to verify your identity using official papers to get a social media account, that it's just not worth what people think. And you've got this problem of famous people, celebrities, footballers, who get nasty abuse online and racist abuse and nasty, not nice stuff. And out of that experience, it's kind of driven them to basically kind of say, let's do whatever it takes for me and others to not get these mean things said to us online. And that includes basically getting even more personal information to social media companies. It also completely ignores the role that social media has in authoritarian states, where people can, express themselves knowing that the state won't be able to figure out exactly who they are. And I think it's actually quite, anyone who calls for that kind of thing, I think, is displaying a kind of a narrow understanding and ignorance, basically, of how people are living in unfree societies. And in unfree societies, the anonymity online is really important, particularly for liberal kind of activists and allies of ours in places like Iran or Russia. We need that. And it's way more important that they stay anonymous and that you don't get insulted online, I'm afraid. And I just couldn't understand the connection between kind of people being rude and nasty to each other online and this apparent jihadist murdering an MP. It was kind of a strange, deflection, or maybe they just thought this is what we can actually do something about, or seem that we're doing something about. It's a red herring. It's a waste of time, and it actually undermines a lot of important things about being anonymous online. There's obviously, a drawback to this anonymity online, and I've not experienced any kind of abuse, and as a white person, I'm not going to experience racist abuse online. I can't imagine how horrible that must feel, and I don't want to undermine that. But I don't think that forcing people, every single person online, to kind of give every single bit of information about themselves to the tech companies is a proportionate response. It's just not. And it's actually driven a lot of this, undo anonymity. This let's do something about anonymity online is driven by celebrities who are active on social media and getting a lot of abuse. Again, I wouldn't defend the abuse, and as I say, I haven't experienced that kind of thing myself. But it's driven by people who are, I don't think, thinking it through enough. And some of the criticism of this has been that people are afraid to mention that this guy is Muslim or that he's a jihadist, and they don't want to talk about that. And to be fair, I initially had that sense, but the truth is, and I had this discussion with a couple of journalists online, and they rightly said, it can prejudice legal proceedings, and I think that's fair enough. I think that if the reason that we're pretending or dealing with the murder of David Amess, David. If we're dealing with the murder of David Amess as kind of the result of people being anonymous online, it might be because simply we can't right now discuss anything else, because that can affect the legal proceedings against the individual who's accused of killing him. So in that sense, I can accept it. I can say, okay. I don't know if that's how the murder of Joe Cox was treated immediately after. I think it was kind of very clear and very openly and initially discussed that this was an right-wing extremist. And in the end, we can say that it's politically easier, of course, to condemn right-wing extremism than it is Islamism, for a number of reasons. But I think I don't think it's controversial to say that.
Yeah, I mean, there definitely is something to this idea of contempt. If you were to describe the act as terrorism, a lot of people get very uppity about headlines that refer to them as attackers, and they're just covering their backs, essentially. I wouldn't necessarily think it's politically motivated to not describe him as a terrorist. It just seems like good journalistic sense. But I tell you what helps me sleep better at night. I tend to feel that there's a mismatch between how the politicians behave and react to these kind of things and what our counter-terrorism services understand about the situation. I seem to think they have a grip on at least the notion that it's ideologically based, and them are the kind of things they should be looking for. And I think that can be seen in the arrest reports we see of potential jihadist or, you know, neo-Nazi members and things like that. And I suppose, somebody who spent a lot of time studying this, are there things where you think our counter-terrorism experts and authorities could be better to understand?
I mean, in terms of the people who are at the sharp edge of it, the intelligence agencies and the counterterrorism police, it's hard for me to judge because of the fact that, by the nature of their work, it's hard to say exactly what they're doing. But, I think one of the things that, the thing is, all these discussions we have and the kind of political correctness and all this stuff, they can't worry about any of that when their job is to kind of just stop the next attack. And overall, I don't have, too much to criticize about how they've gone about their work. They've been pretty effective at thwarting both jihadi and extreme right plots. They've been able to pivot at times where they've had to, as extreme right-wing terrorism has, continued to tick up here, and extremism in general in that within the extreme right. They've been quite good at dealing with that, but at the same time recognize that in terms of deadliness or lethality at the moment, it is the jihad movement that is much more threatening. Many more people are killed here in terms of terrorism. It's relatively very small numbers in general, but many more people are killed here by jihadists than by extreme right wingers. But it only takes one kind of Breivik style attack here, which would be difficult partly because of getting hold of the weapons, but for that to change, but I think my understanding is that they still are fairly cognizant that in terms of lethality, the main threat still comes from mostly kind of ISIS-inspired terrorism than it does from right-wing terrorism. But that could change. That could change quite quickly. So we'll have to see. But no, overall, I think in terms of the hard counterterrorism, I can't really fault them too much. The hardest stuff is the soft power stuff. How do you kind of preventing people from becoming radicalized and stop it, and dealing with the ideology and all that is firstly very difficult for one, because it's a very new kind of, basically this idea of countering radicalization is it's not even, it's about 15 years old. It's from around the time the UK's counterterrorism strategy was relaunched and redeveloped by David Amess. The contest strategy is called, the UK counterterrorism strategy. That was developed in the early 2000s after 9/11. And this was the first time any kind of counterterrorism strategy included the idea of preventing someone from becoming a terrorist. It was, there's always the usual hard measures, arresting, killing, infrastructure development to make sure, major buildings are protected, that kind of hard power and infrastructure stuff. The first time that someone suggested that we do something about preventing someone from becoming a terrorist was this strategy in the early 2000s. And since then, the UK and after that, a number of Western countries have tried to, develop policies around that. And, it's hard to say how that's gone, because for one, it's hard to prove success of something like that. How do you prove that? How do you prove a negative? How do you prove that something you did stop someone from becoming a terrorist? I don't think you can really do that. And much of it is also based around, this idea of de-radicalizing, the idea of changing someone's views, the idea of the state trying to change someone's views. How do you do that? How do you gauge that? We've seen at least one terrorist attack here. I think it was the London Bridge one, where it was someone who had claimed that he had been de-radicalized and they believed him.
I think he came straight from an anti-terrorist seminar.
He was at a prisoner's rehabilitation event, and they believed him. They had bought his claims that he gamed that system and managed to find his opportunity. So it's a flawed approach. I don't think it should be abandoned. I don't think that soft power counterterrorism should be completely abandoned. I just think that it needs to be massively reduced in its scope and its ambition to basically to a version of basically one-on-one interventions, right? So if you can have ways of identifying people that perhaps are en route to acting on extreme ideas, you tailor a program based on that individual to intervene on their lives before they. And this is actually a tried and tested method. Gang interventions. This, it's something that we know can work on a community level. And I think basically that should be what it boils down to: is identifying and intervening in the lives of right-wing extremist jihadis in the UK, who maybe with the right interventions, the right, perhaps mental health or social work or anything like that, can perhaps, pull them away. But this stuff, counter messaging, counter narratives, trying to, fight the ideology via the state, it doesn't. I don't think it's going to work. It hasn't worked.
Yeah. I mean, on a slight digression on authorities and counterterrorism not concerning themselves with being politically correct, I don't know if you recall some time ago in my home city of Manchester, and this was certainly pre-Manchester Arena bombing, the counterterrorism forces held a mock terror attack in a shopping centre, obviously behind closed doors. And I believe the scenario was an attacker with a potential explosive device. And the person cast as, attacker number one was recorded on cell phone cameras shouting Allahu Akbar whilst enacting this role play. And this caused a huge controversy in the press to the point where the authorities had to apologise for it. And I was wondering, those of us who are invested in this argument, that doesn't give us much faith, does it, that we're equipped to tackle the problem?
So I presume the controversy was that it was kind of Islamophobic.
Yeah, it was anti-Muslim, this idea of painting all, terrorist attackers as Muslim. Which is almost, it's fairly certain to say that's probably the case when you're dealing with suicide bombers, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and, again, if we're going to deal with a mass casualty terrorist attack in the UK right now, and certainly over the last 2 decades, the high likelihood is that it would be a jihadist attack, and it would be quite likely that they would say Allahu Akbar when they did it. So as far as replicating a realistic scenario, I don't, it's not a problem to me. As long as, the problem is that, you've got this situation where we're not, the nuance is very hard to get at, because with white supremacists and extreme right, a Nazi is a Nazi. And that's basically kind of, white supremacist is a white supremacist. And because they're from our culture and from our history, it's quite easy for us as a society and as politicians to identify that and to say it's wrong and to not. But because of the fact that it takes quite a lot of background study and knowledge to kind of be able to explain both the difference and the relationship between Islam and Islamism and Jihadism, the nuances there make it much more complicated of a thing to kind of deal with politically. I have no problem with that example that you mentioned. I think, it's if you're training people for a realistic scenario, that's kind of what it's going to look like. And you're just not, in terms of reporting it in the press, in terms of politicians having to give, sound bites on it, you're not going to be able to get into a discussion about, what we're talking about here is, a very, actually quite modern form of Islam that is, Islamism, and it's a political ideology, not just a religion. I mean, who's going to get into that discussion? Unless you're going to sit down for an hour at a podcast, so it's just the nature of it means that it's going to be, it's going to be hard to placate people who want you to pretend, there's people who want you to pretend that Islam's got nothing to do with it. And I'm sorry, that's just simply not, it's just not the case. No serious scholar of jihadist terrorism would ever say that it's got nothing to do with Islam. It's about understanding where Islam has a place in this, where it doesn't, and also, of course, explaining that it's incredibly fringe interpretation of the religion that is not held by the vast majority of Muslims in the world and the UK. But all that nuance, and you see how everything is reported from COVID-19 to terrorism, the nuance is lost. And with something like jihadist terrorism, this religiously inspired form of terrorism, unlike white supremacist terrorism, it's just going to be, that's the nature of it. You're never going to please everyone. You're never going to be able to present it in a way that's going to please the person who's convinced that basically all of this is just a kind of anti-Islamic crusade. So I think you just have to kind of get on with it, and overall, do your best as a government to make it clear that you're dealing with this fringe minority and the differences between. But at the same time, you have to be realistic about the threat. And so that's why I think in the end, the police and MI6 and MI5, they are realistic about it. And every so often they might get some bad press about it, like what you mentioned. But I think that's just the nature of the threat. It's the problem we have is that it's not controversial, right, to say that there is a problem within white working class communities that can be exploited by right-wing extremists, and that you have white working class people who might become right-wing terrorists, right? It's not controversial, and nor should it be. But with the Islam and jihadism question, you are dealing with a minority for one, so that makes it different, and you're dealing with a minority who are in some cases unfairly persecuted. We're seeing anti-Islam politics, gaining ground here, and particularly in Europe, and particularly in France, where most recently, and in the United States, of course. So you are dealing with the minefield is a lot more dense when it comes to dealing with that, because you're dealing with the minority group. You're dealing with the problem of people who do hate Muslims and who do want Muslims out, and who do believe that Muslims are inherently terrorists and a threat. That's just not something you have to vie with when it comes to dealing with white supremacist terrorism. We might at some point find white supremacists start presenting themselves as a kind of minority who are under threat and who should be not spoken. But it's actually so fundamentally different that it means that in the end you're just going to always have those controversies with this type of terrorism that you're just not going to have with other types.
Yeah. There's a lot of baggage, isn't there, when you're dealing with religion, race, and extremism. Before I let you go, I really wanted to touch about the new paper you've co-authored, and that's titled "The Rise of Reactionaries: Comparing the Ideologies of Salafi-Jihadism and White Supremacist Extremists." Now, there's something you pick up on in that which caught my eye, and it's the idea of not necessarily thinking about this situation in terms of a religious wave or a right-wing wave, but looking at it more in the sense of a reactionary wave. What is it you mean by reactionary wave?
Yeah. So to give you a bit of background, so for those of you on the audio, the listeners who are not kind of involved in kind of studying terrorism, there's one of the most influential works on the history of terrorism is a work by a political scientist called David Rappaport. He's defined the history of terrorism as being in four waves, and essentially says that modern terrorism began in the kind of late 1800s with anarchists, the kind of anarchist, sort of pre-Marxist anarchists who engaged in assassinating heads of state and royalty, and who wanted to essentially remove the elites, particularly the monarchies, from power in Europe, and conducted terrorist attacks. Famously the killing of William McKinley, U.S. president, by a Polish American, killing of a number of heads of state in that time period. Right, so that was the first wave, the anarchist wave, the far left, anti-imperialist, anti-monarchy revolutionaries, and that is then followed by the second wave of terrorism, which is kind of the national determination wave. This is basically groups like the IRA or Irish Republicans, EOKA in Cyprus. The groups that were fighting guerrilla insurgencies against colonial powers, right, and removing them from their countries to sort of national determination. And that was considered the second wave of terrorism. The third wave is the New Left wave. These are like the Red Army faction in Germany, the Red Brigades in Italy. These were kind of New Left, communists, Soviet Union sympathizers who were anti-American, anti-globalization, anti-capitalist, who were targeting particularly American targets in Europe, and with not that much success, but the odd kind of successful attack on a U.S. Army base in Germany, for example. And then you have what we're considered to be the wave we're in now, which is understood as the religious wave, which essentially kicked off and inspired by two major events. That's the Iranian Revolution, strangely enough, even though it was a Shiite Islamist revolution. It was the first time Islamists removed kind of Western-backed government and took over and established an Islamic state, and also inspired by the removal of the Soviet Union from Afghanistan, the Mujahideen and the jihad against the Soviets. So again, successfully removes the Soviets from Afghanistan. So it shows you not only the ability to establish an Islamic state, but to use and to mobilize Muslims around the world to join this fight and oust a non-Muslim occupying force in a Muslim country. And the argument was essentially 9/11 was the kind of moment that established us as in being this religious wave. Basically, terrorism today, in that argument, is defined by religious extremism. And one of the debates within terrorism studies today is: are we entering the right-wing wave now? As perhaps we have this sense that jihadist terrorism might be waning, but we thought that actually before ISIS emerged, we thought it was kind of all wrapping up when bin Laden was killed, and then all of a sudden ISIS emerged, and then we have the biggest mobilization of jihadists in history happen. So let's not get too complacent. But anyway, we also know that there is an uptick in right-wing extremism. Brenton Tarrant, Stephen Ballier in Germany, the Halle shooter, Dylan Roof, the United States, shooting the Black Christian church, murdering a number of the congregants there. We're going to see, sadly, quite relatively regular attacks like this by white supremacist extremists. So the question is, are we moving? One of the wrong, in my view, question is, are we moving now from the religious to the right-wing wave? Our argument is actually, from the time that jihadists emerged and the terrorism started being defined by them, we've actually been in what we call the reactionary wave. It's the other three waves I mentioned are basically kind of, on the whole, what we can call left wing. I mean, anarchists and the new left are left wing, and the national determination movements, the guerrilla anti-imperialist movement, we're also, overall, we can call them kind of the momentum behind them as being left wing. This is the first set of terrorists who are actually trying to undo liberal progress that has, that we've enjoyed and experienced over the last few generations. So both the jihadists and these white supremacists are both reactionaries, right? They're both trying to fight back against Western liberal progress, whereas they see it, Western liberal progress, and trying to things, particularly things like feminism, pluralism, minority rights, religious or racial minority rights. So we argue that basically, actually, we're experiencing a terrorism from the jihadists to the right wing that is actually basically being pushed by the same political impulse, which is reactionary politics. And so they both are highly liberal, very suspicious of progress and of pluralism. They're both very chauvinistic. They're both, they have highly chauvinistic collective identities. They're supremacists. We call the white supremacists, but the jihadists are Islamic supremacists, right? They believe that their in-group is inherently better and should be in power, and they have a very chauvinistic view and treatment of any out group in a way that you don't really see with leftist extremists. So in the end, the kind of impulses that are driving these two are very, very similar. The enemies are very similar as well. They're both violently anti-Semitic. Now, again, as you know, if you follow far left politics in the UK, that is certainly not something that is exclusive to the jihad movement and the extreme right. We've seen far left dabble in anti-Semitism for quite some time, but anti-Semitism is not inherent to left-wing and leftist ideology. It's absolutely been used throughout history by leftists, but it's been exploited rather than actually being part of their ideas. If you remove anti-Semitism from the jihad movement, if you remove anti-Semitism from the white supremacist movements, you're actually fundamentally altering them. It's in their DNA, and so they're inherently anti-Semitic. And they both are driven by conspiracy theories that are existential in their nature. They believe that they're both facing existential threats in the form of conspiracy theories. So we talked about the war on Islam for the jihadists. For the For the white supremacists, the white genocide or the great replacement concept. So again, the nature of these things that drive them is very, very similar. And they're both utopianists, right? They both have, again, that's not something exclusive to the jihad movement and the extreme right, but the form of this utopia, the form it would take is quite similar. It's highly purity. It's very focused on purity, so be it racial or religious purity. They both look to the past for the blueprints of the future, right? They both, for the jihadists, of course, the caliphate, reestablishing the caliphate. For white supremacists, depending on who you're talking about, but they are looking for, to reestablish a society that they believe existed in the past, where white people were both separated from other ethnicities, but also were in power and where as their name suggests, where whites reigned supreme. So they both want to go back to some kind of mythic golden age, right? Whereas a leftist extremist is looking to a kind of unrealized future utopias, a society that actually has never existed, or they don't even claim has existed, right? They're actually asking a lot more of you. They're asking you to kind of imagine something that's never happened. Whereas the jihadists and the extreme right are telling you, this existed before and it was successful and it worked. Let's go back to that. So the bigger question is, what does that tell us about the momentum and the politics of today? What does it tell us about what people want today? If the two most successful extremist groups of our era are both basically offering the same thing, just in a different guise, a different language, and different looks different, but it's dressed up differently. But the things that it's appealing to, the chauvinist collective identity, the purist utopias, the reactionary illiberalism, why is that so appealing today? What is that telling us about what growing numbers of people want today? I think we're experiencing, in terrorism, the first attempt to use terrorism to undo liberal progress. And that has never, terrorists of the past didn't try to do that before. The new left, the anarchists, the national, this is not what they were trying to do. They had their own problems, their own flaws, but they were not reactionaries. They were not illiberal. And they did not view progress as an inherently dangerous a thing, and they were not, they were not trying to kill people to undo that. So we're kind of trying to reshape or reframe the discussion about terrorism as not being, okay, we had a religious wave and then we have a right-wing wave. It's actually, this is a reactionary wave, and it started, the jihadists kicked it off, but the extreme right are now, gaining momentum, but demanding very similar things.
That's a really good explanation. So yeah, this hour's flown by. I feel like I could speak to you on this topic for all evening, but I wonder if you want to point people towards your work or where they can find more of what you do.
Sure. Twitter is probably the best way, at @AM-Hitchens. You get mostly the link to my profile, Kings and my books. So, and my rants here and there about something that's wound me up when I regret tweeting about.
That's what Twitter's for, isn't it?
Probably that's the best. I would say that's the best route.
Great. I'll put all those in the show notes so people can find them. Alexander, I really appreciate your work in this space, and thank you very much for speaking to me.
Thanks, Stephen. Really appreciate it. It's an honor to be on the podcast, especially with the kind of people you've had on before. I'm a big fan of a number of them, of course, Ricky Gervais being one of them. But an honor to be on it. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. My pleasure.